Welcome to Shadow Evidence, where Oxford stones carry echoes of secrets too weighty for time to erase. Tonight, we descend into the Bodleian's labyrinth of shelves, where silence reigns and the air smells of vellum and dust. Yet among the pages lies a darker story, for two bodies disturb the library's stillness, their deaths bound by a mystery older than the manuscripts themselves. What truths are concealed in that hallowed quiet, and who among the scholars has turned keeper of something far more lethal than learning? Take a moment before we begin. Mysteries reward those who notice what others overlook. Have you ever solved a story before the end? If you're ready for another case, show your support and become part of our mystery-loving community. Pour yourself something warm, draw the curtains close, and let's uncover the truth. I remember it first as a trick of the light, nothing more. A faint greyness settling over the cobbles of Radcliffe Square, a drizzle softening the outlines of the Sheldonian, the Bodleian brooding like some ancient sphinx, content to keep its riddles sealed. I was not on duty then, nor even thinking of death, unless one counts the half-formed reflection that every evening walk in Oxford carries with it. The awareness that most who built these walls, wrote these words, carved these inscriptions, are long gone, leaving only their dust to stir with ours in the same air. I had stopped, as I often did, at the King's Arms. A crossword lay folded beside a pint that had lost its first bloom of froth. The clue that held me was uncharacteristically elusive. Keeper of secrets in silent stacks, 7. I tried several solutions, archive, custode, even library, but none fitted and none satisfied. A man can waste more than an hour chasing the right word, and I often did. It was then that Professor Blackwell, a don of my very faint acquaintance, passed the table and nodded. He was already 2 drinks deep and inclined to talk. I recall his words less for their import at the time than for the echo they carried later. "One of the librarians has gone missing," he said with a shrug. "Locked rooms, lost keys, some bureaucratic muddle. They'll sort it in the morning." And then, as if delivering the punchline to a joke, he added that the Bodleian had sealed off one of its reading rooms until further notice. I muttered something in response, the kind of half-polite assent one gives when wishing to be left alone. And yet the remark lingered. A missing librarian, a sealed room. Oxford thrives on rumour, but rumours here carry a peculiar chill. I turned again to my puzzle. The answer, though I could not see it then, was curator, a word meaning both guardian and keeper, and one that in its way would become the secret architecture of all that followed. But at that moment it remained hidden, as if the very paper conspired in silence. When at last I drained the glass and stepped outside, the drizzle had hardened to rain. Students hurried past in gowns dampened to darker shades, while a porter fussed at a gate, jangling a ring of keys that seemed to me absurdly medieval. I walked without hurry, letting the sound of wet shoes on stone and the faint tang of wood smoke fix themselves in memory. It is strange what one notices when the mind is elsewhere. The smear of candlelight on a window, the squeak of a bicycle chain unoiled, the brief cry of a gull so far inland. I might have dismissed it all. But there was something about the way Blackwell had spoken, not careless but rehearsed, as if he enjoyed the theatricality of withholding more than he gave. And there was something about the idea of a sealed room that stirred a childish curiosity in me, the sort that had never quite withered. At home, I poured whiskey, and the crossword lay again before me. Keeper of secrets in silent stacks. The irony did not strike until later that night when, lying restless, I thought of the missing man or woman and of a room shut against inquiry. Oxford keeps her silence well. What I did not know then was that silence can rot as surely as it preserves. That beneath the hush of turning pages in the long breath of those vaulted chambers, there was already something waiting. And I, fool that I was, thought it only an academic matter, a story of misplaced keys. It is always like that. A small thing said in passing, a minor clue scribbled in pencil, a word left unfinished in a crossword. The beginning never declares itself. It sidles, it waits, it hides in dusk. Only later does it reveal what it always was, the first whisper of death. Lewis rang just after 9, though I had been awake for hours. Sleep seldom grants me more than fragments, and that night it had been fragments of poetry, broken refrains circling like moths about a weak lamp. His voice was steady, but the words themselves were a summons. There had been a body discovered in the Bodleian, and would I come at once? Rain accompanied me again, as though Oxford meant to insist upon its melancholy. The quad was near deserted, save for the muffled steps of the porter who guided us up the long staircase, his keys clattering like reluctant witnesses. I remember how the light faltered in those corridors, neither day nor night, but some half-illumination that seemed drawn directly from vellum and dust. The door to the upper reading room bore the signs of recent force, the splintered frame, the brass handle bent awkwardly downward. Inside, the air was thick with the odour of old paper, a scent I have always loved, though that morning it carried an undertone I could not yet name. There he was, Dr. Jonathan Miles, sprawled at the foot of the high wooden ladder, spectacles twisted beside him, his right hand curled tightly, as though refusing to release some final argument. Lewis looked at me as if expecting the simplest answer. A fall, he suggested. They said he was reaching for a folio. I bent closer. The ladder itself was upright, stable, its rungs unbroken. A fall was possible, yes. But the posture of the body suggested staging rather than accident, legs neatly gathered, the left arm extended too tidily across the oak boards. Death seldom arranges itself so politely. It was then I saw what his hand concealed, a scrap of paper torn unevenly from a larger page. The ink was blurred, the hand steady, yet faintly smudged by sweat. I prized it loose. The words upon it were a fragment of verse. Into my heart an air that kills. I knew it at once as Houseman, yet something was wrong. The line continued differently in my memory. Miles had either forgotten or altered it, and either possibility seemed strange. A classic scholar of his reputation would not lightly misquote. I placed the slip carefully back with him. Lewis, puzzled, asked if it meant anything. Not yet, I told him. That was true, though already my mind was turning the misquotation over, as one might rotate a chess piece before the first move. The deputy librarian, Eleanor Swithin, entered then. Her face was composed, though her hands betrayed a tremor she tried to conceal by clasping them firmly behind her back. She said he had been working late, cataloguing manuscripts. She herself had locked the room, as was procedure, yet the keys were found not with her, but upon the porter's ring. An irregularity explained away with bureaucratic vagueness. I asked when she had last spoken with Miles. "Yesterday evening," she replied, "about some disputed attribution." She avoided my eyes as she spoke, and I noticed a faint ink stain along the cuff of her blouse, as if she too had been scribbling hurriedly into the night. Lewis busied himself with the scene. No overturned chairs, no broken glass, nothing disturbed beyond the man himself. Silence layered thick upon silence. It was almost as though the library had absorbed the sound of his death into its own stillness. I lingered by the desk nearest to him. A register lay open, listing the few who had signed in. 2 names that day, Miles and Clara Haldane, a postgraduate whose brilliance was much discussed in certain circles. She had signed out earlier, the neatness of her script oddly at odds with the hurried scrawl of others. I made a note. Outside, the rain deepened, rattling faintly against high windows. Lewis muttered that it looked straightforward, an unfortunate accident. I said nothing. For me, the misquoted verse, the odd orderliness of the body, the matter of the missing keys, these had already unsettled the narrative. Accidents seldom compose themselves so literately. We left the room finally, the porter locking it once more, as if sealing not just the dead, but the questions with him. And yet the smell of old paper followed me down the staircase, mingled with that other undertone I could now name. Not dust, nor damp, but the faint iron of blood. It was then, and only then, that the crossword clue from the night before returned to me. Keeper of secrets in silent stacks I had not solved. It then, but now, a darker possibility suggested itself. Some secrets, I thought, do not wish to be kept. Oxford provides no shortage of shadows, but it is the human ones that endure longest. The Bodleian had offered me its first body. Now it seemed determined to present the living as enigmas no less opaque. I have often thought that death is easy to read, its grammar severe, its punctuation final. It is the sentences of the living that twist, elide, contradict. Eleanor Swithin came first, the deputy librarian. A woman of severe precision, as if she herself had been catalogued in the Bodleian stacks, every thought arranged under subject headings. She told me she admired Dr. Miles, though admiration in her mouth sounded indistinguishable from resentment. Her voice faltered once, when I asked about his habits after hours. He worked too late, she confessed, always with the lights burning long past regulation. I wondered then whether her irritation at his disregard for procedure concealed something warmer or colder. Then Professor Adrian Vale, a Shakespearean scholar with an appetite for applause and a fondness for quotation, delivered with theatrical relish. He spoke of Miles as a colleague, even a rival, yet behind the courteous tone lingered disdain. He said Miles lacked the reach of intellect required for true originality. His words were lofty, yet his eyes lingered too long on Clara Haldane when she entered the room. I noted the contradiction, disparagement of one man's learning, alongside hunger for the approval of his student. Clara herself was the third, and she troubled me most. She was younger than the rest, though her poise disguised it. A postgraduate, brilliant by all accounts, with that rare ability to make others feel suddenly ill-prepared. She spoke softly of Dr. Miles, calling him a kind mentor, yet in her hesitation I detected something withheld. When I asked whether she had been present in the library that day, she confirmed it readily, almost too readily, and her account matched the register's script. Still, the neatness of her handwriting, the almost ornamental flourish of the letters, whispered to me of someone conscious of appearances, someone rehearsed in leaving a trace that concealed as much as it declared. Finally, Harold Penrose, the retired archivist. He had been displaced by newer methods, computer systems he neither understood nor wished to. His bitterness was palpable, a man who believed the modern world had turned its back upon him. He spoke of Miles with the weary air of one who has been ignored too often. Miles, he said, had little respect for tradition and less for those who embodied it. Yet when I pressed, he grew vague, his eyes travelling to some invisible ledger only he could read. Each of them, then, had motive enough, irritation sharpened into envy, rivalry soured into malice, gratitude confused with desire, resentment calcified into bitterness. And yet motive alone is a blunt instrument. It carves no fine truth. I returned in my mind to the scrap of Hausmann, that misquoted line, "Into my heart, an air that kills." The poem speaks of a land of lost content, yet Miles had altered it, leaving the verse unfinished, untrue. Why? A slip of memory seemed implausible. Was it a signal directed at one of these faces now arranged before me? Or was it merely the accident of a dying hand? I let the question rest, though uneasily. Lewis, with his unvarnished candour, said they all looked guilty to him. I told him guilt in Oxford was plentiful. The trick was finding which kind of guilt had tipped the balance. He looked at me strangely, but said no more. What I did observe, though, was Clara's glance towards Vale when she believed herself unobserved. It was not admiration, not quite. Something in it combined curiosity with fear, like a student who has heard too many versions of the same lecture and wonders what lies between the lines. And so the shadows lengthened. I had 4 figures, each drawn with a dark stroke, yet the outlines blurred when I tried to fix them. Perhaps that is what Oxford does best. It hides truth in footnotes, in half-remembered lines of poetry, in corridors where footsteps echo without revealing who walks ahead. The scrap of paper would not leave me. All through that night it hovered at the edge of thought, as stubborn as a tune one half remembers. Into my heart an air that kills, I knew it by heart, or thought I did. Houseman's line, pared to bone, bitter as ale left too long in the glass. But there was a fracture where Miles had left it. He had not gone on to the land of lost content. He had stopped early, arrested the cadence, as if death itself had silenced the verse. And the more I stared at the words in memory, the more it seemed deliberate. A classic scholar does not forget his lines. By the following morning I had convinced myself of 2 things. The line was no accident, and it had been left for someone. Who, I could not yet say. I returned to the Bodleian under a sky pale with reluctant light, the kind that makes Oxford resemble its own ghost. Lewis was already there, waiting with that expression which always asked without words whether my imaginings had carried me any further than his certainties. He had been through the registers again, he said. No one had signed since the discovery. The reading room remained sealed, though its silence seemed now less like reverence and more like conspiracy. Eleanor Swithin met us with that air of brittle composure which librarians perfect, as if words themselves must be guarded against intrusion. She asked whether progress had been made. I told her only that we were examining Miles's papers. She stiffened, then relented, leading us to his desk. There I found little of note, orderly files, a neat row of index cards, the occasional annotation in a hand too careful to betray emotion. And yet, tucked between 2 volumes of Catullus, I found another slip of paper. Not a line of poetry, this. Time, but a crossword clue copied in Miles's script. Rival's pride confused, 6. It seemed unsolved, left as though in rehearsal. I folded it away. Pride, confused, an anagram perhaps. The letters, I suspected, would matter later. We spoke briefly with Vale at his college. He received us in a room heavy with the smell of cigars and theatrically arranged books. He spoke of Houseman with glib familiarity, but when I asked him to complete the line, "Into my heart an air that kills," he supplied it readily and correctly. His memory was unimpeachable, though his eagerness to display it was itself suspect. Clara was mentioned only in passing, yet the curve of his mouth betrayed something closer to obsession. Clara herself I found later in the Bodleian quad, the rain having lifted just enough to leave the stone glistening. She looked almost luminous against the damp, though her eyes carried that mixture of fatigue and defiance which marks the clever young when pressed by older men. I asked if Miles had ever recited poetry in her presence. She smiled faintly, said he was more likely to correct her Latin than to quote Houseman. And yet when I repeated the misquoted line, her brow furrowed, as though recognizing something she had half heard before. She said nothing further, and I did not press. That evening, in the King's Arms once more, I set the crossword slip beside my pint. Rival's pride confused. The letters rearranged themselves slowly in my mind until I saw it. Drivel. A cruel solution, if deliberate. Was this Miles's private judgment on a rival's scholarship, or had he left the clue unfinished as bait? Either way, the echo of pride rang through it, and pride, I knew, was not confined to Miles. I recalled Eleanor's tremor, Vale's vanity, Clara's unreadable glance, Penrose's bitterness. Each contained pride of a different shade, and in Oxford, pride is the coin that purchases both brilliance and ruin. Yet it was the misquotation that lingered still. To omit the land of lost content was to deny memory itself. Perhaps that was the key. Not what Miles remembered, but what he chose to erase. I left the pub late, my head thick with whiskey and unfinished thoughts. Rain had begun again, pattering against the darkened shop fronts, running along the gutters like ink across a page. I thought of Miles's cramped hand clutching that torn line, and I thought of silence. Silence in libraries, silence in death. And I wondered whether silence itself was the message, more eloquent than any word. The letter arrived without ceremony, slipped beneath the office door as though it had crept there on its own. Lewis found it first, a plain envelope with no mark save the faint impression of hurried fingers. Inside lay a single sheet, typed rather than written, as if anonymity might be better guarded by the machine. The words were brief. Ask the deputy librarian about her nights with Miles. She knows more than she says. Lewis, eager for direction, looked at me expectantly. It fits, doesn't it? A jealous quarrel, a lover's anger. I said nothing, though in truth the suggestion had a certain surface neatness. Eleanor Swithin, with her precision and her tremor, her irritation with Miles's disregard for procedure, it was plausible enough to picture her entangled with him, and plausible again to imagine the entanglement soured. We called her to the station that afternoon. She sat stiffly, her back straight against the chair, as though posture alone might shield her. She denied the letter's implication, yet her voice carried a sharpness that spoke more of fear than innocence. Miles was a colleague, nothing more. I respected him, admired his work, no more than that. Lewis pressed further, asking if she had ever been in the reading room after hours with him. She shook her head too quickly. It was then I noticed the faintest detail. The envelope itself had borne no stamp, no address. It had been delivered by hand. Whoever wrote it had access to the Bodleian or to us. Such intimacy of delivery is rarely born of chance. That evening I walked again through the rain-slick streets, my thoughts circling the letter like moths about a dim flame. In my pocket, the crossword slip I had taken from Miles's desk. Rival's pride, confused, 6. Drivel. Could it be his comment on Eleanor dismissing her catalogues as petty? Or on Vale, whose grandiloquence begged to be cut down to size? If directed at Eleanor, the insult would wound deeply, and wounds, left to fester, can harden into violence. The next day we visited her lodgings, a modest house off the Banbury Road. Books lined every shelf, arranged with military neatness, and on the desk lay a diary bound in blue leather. She tried to close it when she saw my eyes drift, but not quickly enough. Lewis caught the corner and read aloud, "Met J. again in the upper room. Afterwards, silence." Eleanor grew pale, insisting the entries referred to a junior colleague long since departed, but her voice lacked conviction, and the hurried scrawl of the letters J seemed too near to Miles to be coincidence. Lewis was all but certain. He pictured a confrontation, an argument, perhaps a push from the ladder. the body placed carefully, the key retrieved from the porter afterwards. It hung together tolerably well. For an hour I almost believed it. Yet even as the pieces aligned, unease pressed against me. I thought again of Miles's misquotation. Into my heart, an air that kills. If his final gesture were a message to Eleanor, why Houseman? Why not some line the two had shared? And why the crossword clue left unresolved? The false trail glittered with too much neatness. That night, over whiskey, I recalled something trivial yet insistent. Eleanor's blouse on the morning we met, ink stained at the cuff. If she had written the anonymous letter herself, why choose to type it? Handwriting betrays too much, yes, but she had always preferred the pen. And the diary, with its ambiguous J-dash, seemed a little too available, left upon the desk as though waiting to be found. Was guilt ever so accommodating? I set the letter down and poured again. Oxford thrives on shadows, and in shadows one shape can be mistaken for another. For a while I allowed myself to drift into Lewis's certainty because certainty has its comforts. But beneath it I felt the restlessness I always feel when the truth lies just beyond reach, disguised by its own clarity. It was Lewis who found the diary, though it was I who understood the weight of its silence. Miles had kept a small, leather-bound volume among his papers, its cover worn, the spines softened by years of use. Inside, the entries were precise, almost clinical, appointments, meetings, references to texts under review. Nothing of the man himself appeared there, only the record of his days as though his life were a catalogue. And yet, for the week of his death, the pages had been neatly excised, not torn, not damaged, but removed with a careful blade. Silence has many registers, but deliberate silence has its own eloquence. Lewis thought it might indicate shame, perhaps some private matter, an affair he wished concealed. I could not help but agree, superficially at least, for the anonymous letter still sat in my pocket, whispering of Eleanor. But a diary does not remove its own pages, and if Miles had done so, why leave the volume behind at all? The act was too visible, too theatrical, like a curtain drawn not to hide, but to advertise concealment. We visited Harold Penrose that afternoon. He lived in a narrow house whose rooms smelt of pipe smoke and damp wool. He welcomed us with a courtesy tinged by resentment, as if our presence confirmed his continued relevance. He spoke of the old days in the Bodleian, when catalogues were handwritten and silence was enforced with severity. Miles, he said, had treated tradition with contempt, preferring new systems, younger minds. They argued often. Once, only a week before his death, Penrose had seen him in heated words with Professor Vale in the quad. He could not hear the substance, only the rhythm. Vale's grandiloquent phrases punctuated by Miles's sharper, quieter retorts. Two men circling, each unwilling to yield. Penrose poured tea with hands that trembled slightly. He asked whether the death was truly an accident, his voice carrying something more than curiosity. I told him we were keeping all possibilities in view. He seemed satisfied, though his eyes betrayed a gleam I could not name. Pride, perhaps, that he still knew more than the living scholars who had displaced him. Walking back, I thought again of the missing diary pages. What is omitted tells as much as what is recorded. In the crossword folded still in my coat, yesterday's clue had taunted me. Concealment makes half the truth. 5. The answer, when at last it came to me, was masks. A small deduction, but fitting. Miles had masked something, not merely an affair, but a truth tied to his quarrels, his rivalries, his pride. That evening we sought out Vale. He received us in his rooms, surrounded by books piled less for use than for display. He admitted the quarrel with Miles, though he framed it as academic debate. Miles, he claimed, had questioned the authenticity of a recently attributed manuscript, a Shakespearean fragment Vale had been preparing for publication. Vale insisted Miles lacked the vision to see its significance. His voice, as he spoke, grew almost rapturous, though beneath the flourish I detected the thin edge of desperation. Clara's name surfaced again, almost carelessly. She had been present during some of these debates, Vale said, her keen intellect drawing admiration from both men. He laughed as he spoke, but the laughter was brittle. I asked whether Clara had been aware of the quarrel's severity. Vale dismissed the idea. Students, he said, rarely see the true stakes of scholarship. Yet I remembered the way Clara's eyes had flickered when I recited the misquoted Houseman. She had seen more than Vale supposed. That night in my flat I laid out the fragments before me. The diary with its silence, the scrap of verse, the crossword slips, the letter. Each pointed in a different direction, yet none resolved. Eleanor's diary entries, ambiguous as they were, might conceal more than passion. Vale's scholarship, more fragile than he would admit, could collapse if Miles had truly found fault. Penrose, with his nostalgia turned sour, carried decades of quiet grievance. And Clara, brilliant, elusive, was somehow tethered to them all. I poured whiskey and thought of silence again. A library is never entirely silent. There is always the faint rustle of pages, the creak of boards, the cough suppressed in a distant aisle. True silence is unnatural, and when I looked at those cut pages I felt something unnatural had been imposed. What Miles had written there, someone wanted erased. And the absence, more than the words themselves, might prove fatal. Oxford thrives on words, yet here I faced a silence sharper than speech. I told myself that soon the missing lines would surface, in memory if not in ink. But that night, as rain began once more against the glass, all I held was the weight of a diary that spoke by not speaking. Oxford has always loved its ceremonies, the rituals polished by centuries until they shine with a kind of indifference. That evening I found myself seated at high table, in Vale's college, beneath portraits whose painted eyes had watched the same processions for generations. Candles burned steadily along the length of the oak, the scent of wax mingling with roasted meat and the faint dust of velvet gowns. There was a hush before grace, and in that hush I felt more acutely than ever the absence of Dr. Miles. Lewis, beside me, shifted uncomfortably in his borrowed gown. He muttered that the formality sat poorly with him, though his voice was quickly swallowed by the scrape of chairs and the clatter of silver. Vale, presiding at the centre, rose to deliver the customary toast. His words, as always, were steeped in Shakespearean cadence, each line rolling out as though rehearsed upon a stage. He spoke of scholarship, of friendship, of the inexhaustible pursuit of truth. But beneath the flourish there was a brittleness I had not noticed before. Then came the moment. Vale, warming to his theme, quoted Houseman, "Into my heart an air that kills." He paused, allowed the line to settle, and completed it with a flourish, "From yon far country blows." The line was correct, and yet I felt a tremor, for it was the very verse Miles had left, misquoted, in death. Coincidence, perhaps. But coincidences in Oxford have a habit of concealing intention. I glanced at Clara across the table. She sat very still, her face lit unevenly by candlelight. Her eyes did not rest on Vale, though his rested often upon her. Instead, she seemed to study the rim of her glass, as though searching for patterns in the reflection. When Vale concluded, the applause rose politely, yet Clara's hands did not move. Afterwards, in the common room, the dons drank port with the satisfaction of men convinced they had upheld tradition simply by repeating it. Lewis whispered that Vale had quoted Houseman deliberately, a display of erudition to impress the gathering. Perhaps. But I recalled the crossword clue still folded in my pocket. Rival's pride, confused. If pride had driven Vale to perform Miles's verse, then pride itself might prove his undoing. Clara lingered near the fire, apart from the circle. I approached, and she greeted me with a half-smile that seemed more weary than warm. I asked whether she found the evening agreeable. She replied that scholarship and theatre were closer cousins than most admitted, and that Vale had blurred the boundary further than usual. Her voice held neither admiration nor contempt, but something quieter, an ambivalence I could not easily read. Lewis, emboldened by wine, asked her whether she had seen Miles and Vale quarrelling. She hesitated, then admitted she had, though she described it as an academic disagreement. She said Miles was precise to the point of severity, Vale expansive to the point of arrogance. Two styles destined to clash. And when I asked if she thought Miles capable of cruelty, she answered only that cruelty can take many shapes, some so polished they look like courtesy. The evening wound down, chairs scraping back, gowns brushing against stone. I left the hall with the words of Vale's toast still ringing, their grandeur already fading in the damp night air. Lewis said he thought we had our man, the rivalry, the quarrels, the pride. But something held me back. Vale's vanity was obvious, almost too obvious, as if painted for our inspection. The true clue, I felt, lay not in what he had spoken, but in Clara's silence, in her still hands amid the applause. Back in my rooms, I wrote a single word, in the margin of my notebook. Coincidence? Then beneath it, another theatre. Oxford performs itself endlessly, and we are too often its audience. Yet in the performance lies the possibility of truth, if only one learns to listen not to the lines, but to the pauses between them. The Bodleian's archives are a labyrinth even for those who believe they know them. Corridors curve into one another with the logic of dreams, and drawers slide open to reveal layers of memory no less fragile than vellum. It was Lewis who first uncovered the photograph. He had been leafing through boxes of ephemera, sighing at the dust that clung to his sleeves, when he called me over with the mild surprise of one who has stumbled upon something both ordinary and unsettling. The photograph was black and white, slightly faded at the edges, but the figures were clear enough. A group gathered on the lawn of some college garden, all in their youth. 4 faces leapt forward from the paper. Jonathan Miles, younger, leaner, his eyes already severe. Beside him, Harold Penrose, hair still dark, the corners of his mouth turned in that same sardonic half-smile I had seen days earlier. And there, unmistakable in the centre, Adrian Vale, a touch of arrogance even then in the way he inclined his head. But it was the 4th figure that drew me, a young woman with striking features, unfamiliar at first glance, until Lewis muttered that she bore more than a passing resemblance to Clara. It was resemblance, yes, but not identity. I asked the archivist if he could date the photograph. He shrugged, suggested late 60s, perhaps early 70s. That would make the woman too old to be Clara. A mother, then? And in that thought lay a shift I had not expected. Clara was not simply the gifted student drawn into a circle of rivalries. She was the echo of a past entanglement, walking in Oxford's present like a ghost reprising an earlier role. I carried the photograph back to my rooms that night. On the desk beside me lay the crossword from 2 evenings before, still unsolved in part. A clue caught my eye again. Past returns, haunting present, 7. The answer, when it came, was replica. The word seemed to breathe across the page as I compared the faces. Clara, the replica of her mother, both drawn into the same web of men whose scholarship masked their longings. When I questioned Penrose about the image, he was slow to admit recognition. At last he sighed, confessing that the woman had indeed been Clara's mother, a student once courted by both Miles and Vale. He himself had admired her too, though from a distance. He said little more, only that she had left Oxford suddenly, her name scarcely mentioned thereafter. The bitterness in his tone suggested a wound never quite scabbed over. Lewis, more straightforward, asked if this changed anything. I told him it changed everything, though I could not yet say how. Oxford is a city where the past lies not behind but beneath, surfacing at intervals, like a body in a river. Clara had inherited not merely intelligence but the shadow of her mother's history, and shadows in Oxford are rarely benign. Later I spoke with Clara herself. I showed her the photograph, and she stared at it for a long time without speaking. At last she whispered that her mother had rarely spoken of her student days, only that she had left abruptly, disillusioned. Clara asked whether Miles had mentioned her. I said only that his past seemed closer to her than she might have guessed. She looked away then, and I caught the faintest trace of fear, or was it resolve? Her silence was more telling than words. That night the photograph lay on my desk, lit by the dim circle of the lamp. I studied the faces again and again, tracing the lines between them, Miles's severity, Vale's vanity, Penrose's sardonic gaze, the woman's beauty, Clara's echo. The missing diary pages might well have touched upon this, a rediscovered betrayal, an old flame rekindled or extinguished, a rivalry renewed. Whatever Miles had written, someone had found reason to cut it away. I poured a whisky and watched the rain begin once more against the glass. Oxford does not bury its past, it archives it, carefully labelled, occasionally forgotten, and then, at the least convenient moment, retrieved. That photograph was no mere relic. It was a reminder that our present puzzles are written in old ink, fading, but never erased. It was Lewis who asked, almost impatiently, whether we were not simply circling the inevitable. Vale, he said, fits everything, the rivalry, the quarrels, the arrogance, even the misquoted line, if one chose to believe it, a deliberate mirror held up by his adversary. Wasn't it time we admitted the case had written itself? I wanted to believe him. For a few hours I almost did. The theory, like so many false solutions, had a seductive neatness. Vale, obsessed with his fragment, threatened by Miles's disapproval, had confronted him in the library. A push from the ladder, a staged fall, the scrap of verse torn from Miles's own notes to point elsewhere. Motive, means, opportunity, all aligned with enviable symmetry. That afternoon we called again at Vale's rooms. He welcomed us with a mixture of charm and defensiveness, as though long accustomed to defending his brilliance against lesser minds. He admitted freely that Miles had opposed the attribution of his Shakespearean fragment, even threatened to publish a refutation. It would have ruined him. He spoke with the fervour of a man who sees truth as performance, evidence as rhetoric. His words tumbled, elegant but desperate. Lewis looked at me, satisfied. Here was our man, yet even as Vale confessed to heated words, to pride wounded, he denied any involvement in the death. He swore he had been at a dinner that very evening, surrounded by witnesses. His alibi was sufficient, though sufficiency is not the same as certainty. I left with the uneasy comfort of a puzzle apparently solved. That night, whisky in hand, I rehearsed the case to myself. The diary's missing pages, surely torn away because they contained Miles's doubts about Vale's scholarship. The crossword clue, drivel, his private dismissal of the rival's work. The misquoted Houseman, a final barb, aimed squarely at the man who lived for quotation. Even Clara's silence at the college dinner could be read as fear of Vale, fear of the man who might have struck her mentor down. And yet unease gnawed at me. The theory glistened, but glistened too brightly. I have learnt that truth in Oxford is rarely so theatrical. The crossword I had been brooding over for days offered its own quiet rebuke. Conceit undone by error, 5. The answer was valet, a word uncomfortably near to Vale. Lewis, when I pointed it out, laughed and said the setters had solved the case before we had, but I felt instead a prick of warning. Coincidence, perhaps. Yet Oxford delights in coincidences, that wound. I thought then of Clara. When I had shown her the photograph, her silence had not been one of ignorance, but of recognition. If Vale had killed Miles, why had her fear seemed directed elsewhere? And Eleanor, so precise, so tremulous, why leave her so exposed by the anonymous letter if Vale were truly guilty? The pieces did fit Vale, but fit too easily, as if arranged for display. Like the staged body in the reading room, his guilt was positioned where we might see it at once. And just as with that too-orderly corpse, the orderliness itself was the flaw. Still for a day, I allowed myself the false comfort of certainty. We even drafted notes for the chief superintendent, outlining Vale's quarrels, his threatened reputation, his opportunity. Lewis was almost cheerful. I even caught myself thinking of Clara again, foolishly, as though the case might release her once we tied it to Vale. But my heart was never fully convinced. It was only later, returning once more to the scrap of Houseman, that doubt hardened into refusal, into my heart an air that kills. Miles had not misquoted to accuse Vale. He had stopped short, refused the land of lost content. That omission was too deliberate, too personal, and Vale's vanity was too public to fit such private subtlety. We had our second false solution, polished and persuasive, but false nonetheless. And I once more was left with the ache of having mistaken theatre for truth. It was the crossword that returned me to the beginning, as it so often does. I had set it aside days earlier, unfinished, the squares left gaping like unanswered questions. That evening, restless, I unfolded it again in the dim circle of the lamp. The clue stared back. Silence in libraries conceals hidden bodies. 7. I had passed it over before, distracted by the business of death, but now it seemed to demand attention. 7 letters. I tested possibilities, rolling them in my mind. Cadaver, too blunt. Tombs, too short. And then it came. Stature. Not bodies in the sense of corpses, but in the sense of presence, of standing. Hidden stature, concealed by silence. The setter had played with the ambiguity, but it struck me with more than wordplay. Miles had been obsessed with standing, his own, Vale's, Penrose's. His final days had circled around questions of reputation, of stature. That was what the diary's missing pages must have recorded. I sat back, the whiskey glass untouched beside me. Silence, stature, bodies concealed. It was not Vale's pride that mattered, nor Eleanor's supposed affair, but the long shadow of careers won and lost, honours granted and withheld. Oxford builds reputations as carefully as it buries them, and Miles had been custodian of both. I thought then of Penrose, the old archivist, his sardonic mouth, his eyes that gleamed with something beyond bitterness. His career had ended in the shadow of Miles's rise. He had spoken of traditions scorned, of being replaced by younger minds. I remembered, too, the photograph, Penrose beside Miles, Vale, and Clara's mother. A past intimacy, a rivalry that stretched back decades, and the misquoted Houseman line, "Into my heart an air that kills, abandoned before the land of lost content." Miles had left unfinished not a poem, but a judgment. It was not about Vale at all. Lewis came by that night, bringing with him the weary optimism of one who thinks the case nearly tied. He asked if I had resolved the crossword at last. I told him the answer, stature. He laughed, said it suited Vale perfectly. But I shook my head. Vale had vanity, yes, but vanity is loud. The crime, I felt, belonged to someone who understood silence, who lived in it. Penrose, guardian of archives, keeper of forgotten names, silence was his element. Lewis frowned, unconvinced. He asked, what of the diary, what of the missing pages? They would surface, I said, or they would not. But their absence already spoke loudly. If Miles had discovered something, an old plagiarism, an academic theft, a betrayal from decades past, it would have shattered what little Penrose still clung to. And pride, once wounded, can kill more ruthlessly than envy. I thought again of the body at the foot of the ladder, too neatly placed, too carefully arranged. Not the chaos of accident, but the composition of someone who understood the theatre of scholarship, who knew that even a corpse could be staged as text. And who better than a librarian, an archivist, to curate a body? The rain began once more, pattering against the dark panes. In that sound I felt the case shifting, the false solution dissolving like ink in water. Vale's pride, Eleanor's tremor, Clara's silence. They were still part of the pattern, but not the centre. The centre was Penrose, and Miles had known it. That was why the Houseman line had stopped short, why the crossword clue lingered unfinished. He had been writing his own epitaph, disguised in puzzles only the guilty might decode. I told Lewis as much, though not in so many words. He muttered that Penrose was too old, too weary, too broken for murder. But weariness can conceal more venom than youth, and brokenness more cruelty than ambition. That night I could not sleep. I saw again the photograph, the faces caught in a moment of youth, already bearing the seeds of rivalry. I heard Vale's Shakespearean flourishes, Eleanor's clipped denials, Clara's silence, and behind them all, Penrose's smile, half sardonic, half triumphant, the smile of a man who knew the value of silence because he had lived his life in it. The crossword lay solved before me, but its answer gave no comfort. Stature, hidden in silence, measured not in words, but in what was withheld. Miles had understood it at the last. I was only just beginning to. It was late when I asked Penrose to meet me. The library was closed to readers, its echoing chambers left only to the silence that lingers when books sleep. He arrived without protest, walking slowly among the shelves as though reacquainting himself with companions who had long since turned their backs. The lamps cast narrow pools of light, leaving the aisles in half-shadow. It seemed an appropriate stage for what was to follow. We stopped in the very room where Miles had been found. The ladder still leaned against the shelf, its rungs innocent, the floorboards scrubbed of all memory. Penrose rested his hand on the oak, and for a moment I thought he might not speak at all. Then he sighed, as though exhaling decades of grievance. He asked whether I already knew. I told him I suspected. He smiled faintly at that, the same sardonic curl I had seen before. Miles had destroyed him, he said, not in one stroke, but in the quiet cruelty of scholarship. Years earlier, Penrose had produced a catalogue, a labour of love, filled with careful attributions. Miles had dismissed it as careless, misleading, unworthy of preservation. His judgment, given in the right rooms to the right ears, had ended Penrose's career. He paused, tracing the ladder's worn rung with his finger. Miles knew what it meant, he said. He knew the power of silence, how a man could be buried without ever being named. And when, in those last weeks, Miles threatened to raise old disputes again, to expose errors long past, Penrose realized he was being consigned to silence once more. Only this time he would not endure it. Lewis, listening in the shadows, shifted uneasily, but I said nothing. Penrose continued, his voice steady, almost calm. He had confronted Miles in the reading room. Words had passed, sharp, cutting. Miles, he claimed, had mocked him, reminded him that Oxford had already forgotten him. And then the fall. Not rage, he said, but resolution. A push, a hand withdrawn from the rung at the right moment. Miles had collapsed silently, as though already part of the hush he guarded. The staging had come afterwards? Penrose admitted to arranging the body, slipping the scrap of Houseman into his hand. He chose the misquotation, deliberately, he said, to suggest confusion, an accident of memory, perhaps despair. It amused him that scholars would puzzle over a poet's line while ignoring the truth beneath. Silence is the only inscription that endures. His words were not boastful, but weary, the confession of a man who no longer feared judgment. I asked about the diary pages. He nodded. He had taken them, yes. They contained notes, references to his old catalogue, critical remarks Miles had prepared for some forthcoming lecture. Penrose had burned them that same night. He had left the absence behind, as eloquent as words could ever be. Lewis asked, why confess now? Penrose shrugged. Because you already knew, because the silence was heavier than the guilt. I watched him then, an old man among the shelves, shoulders stooped but voice unbroken. It struck me that in his way he had won. Miles was gone, his reputation unresolved, while Penrose would be remembered, if only as the man who had broken the silence with death. We walked him out quietly. No struggle, no resistance. He seemed almost grateful, as though the act of being led away was itself a form of release. Later, alone, I returned to the reading room. I climbed the ladder, touched the shelf from which Miles had supposedly fallen. The wood was smooth beneath my hand. I thought of Houseman's line again, halted before the land of lost content. Perhaps Miles himself had known what was coming, had felt the air that kills drifting nearer. Or perhaps it was only Penrose's hand, steady at last, that carried him into silence. Either way, the library had reclaimed its hush. Only the faint creak of the boards beneath me disturbed it, and even that was quickly swallowed. Oxford endures, the rest of us. Footnotes. The Bodleian reopened 3 days later. The porter swung the great doors wide with the same indifference as before, as though death and confession had been no more than a passing inconvenience. Readers returned at once, their footsteps tentative, their voices hushed, their eyes lifting occasionally towards the gallery where Miles had fallen. But books do not mourn, and the air of the library soon thickened again with turning pages, the scratch of pencils, the rustle of bags. Silence reasserted itself, indifferent and whole. Lewis said it was finished. The case was clear, the confession adequate, the paperwork waiting. He spoke of Penrose with a mixture of pity and contempt. I let him speak. He was young enough still to believe in conclusions. I had seen too many to trust them. That evening, I walked alone through Radcliffe Square. The rain had returned, light at first, then heavy, striking the stone with a rhythm as old as the buildings themselves. Lamps shimmered in the wet cobbles, blurred reflections that looked like flames drowning. Oxford glowed faintly through the mist, as though the city itself were reluctant to be seen. I thought of Clara then, the way she had looked at the photograph, her silence more eloquent than words. She had departed the day before, a note left with Lewis, her studies suspended, her future undecided. She had thanked us for our diligence, though the words felt less like gratitude than resignation. Her mother's shadow had proved too heavy, her mentor's death too close. She had chosen departure over entanglement, as her mother had decades earlier. I will admit I felt the absence keenly, a foolish thought perhaps, but one I could not banish. I imagined her brilliance flowering elsewhere, far from Oxford's walls, untethered to its rivalries, and I left once more with nothing but silence and whisky. In my rooms I returned to the crossword one last time. The clue I had avoided now pressed itself forward. Final word, never spoken. 4. The answer, obvious once seen, was AMN. I penciled it in, the letters dark and sharp against the pale newsprint. A small solution, yet it felt like closure of a kind. Not justice, perhaps, but an ending, or the shadow of one. Still, doubts persisted. Penrose's confession had been calm, precise, but confessions are themselves performances. Had he spoken truth, or only the truth as he wished it remembered? The missing diary pages forever ash, the photograph an echo without explanation, the misquoted line an air that kills. They lingered in my mind like unanswered clues, each one sufficient to disturb the symmetry of the solution. Oxford has a way of keeping its riddles unsolved. Its stones breathe secrecy. Its libraries thrive on erasure as much as preservation. I had learnt only this, that silence itself may be the truest inscription, the one that endures when all words fail. I poured whisky, let it burn its quiet warmth through me, and listened to the rain. The case was closed, yet Miles remained, his presence folded into the hush of the reading room, his voice cut short, his verse unfinished. Penrose remained too, his bitterness confessed, but not extinguished, his silence preserved in new form. And Clara, perhaps she would forget Oxford, or perhaps it would call her back, as it always does. I thought then of Hausmann's line once more. Into my heart an air that kills. Miles had left it incomplete, but perhaps incompleteness was the point. Perhaps the land of lost content is not a place but an omission, a refusal to finish the line, silence as destination, silence as verdict. When at last I turned out the lamp, Oxford lay quiet beyond the window, rain whispering against the glass. The library, the quad, the river, all held in a silence older than any of us, and I knew, as I have always known, that the silence does not yield, only deepens.